Nine, 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 nine. I nine, 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 nine. Itty, die, 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 and nine. And a nine, and a nine, nine, and nine, and a nine, and nine, and a nine, nine, and nine, and a nine, and nine, and a nine. Nine, 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 and nine. 89, nine, 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 nine. 89, nine, 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 and nine, and nine, and nine, and nine, and nine, 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 89, and nine, and nine, nine, and nine, 89, and nine, 89, nine, and nine, 89, 89, nine, 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 and nine. Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. I'm thrilled to be with you today. Happy Tuesday, happy spring, and good to be with you all today to discuss the psychology of tribalism. Let's start with a poll question. I view myself as option one, very tribal, option two, tribal in some ways, option three, totally anti-tribal. This is just a little self-awareness question. Are you very tribal in your self-identity? Are you tribal in some ways, or are you totally anti-tribal? 100%! Something's gone wrong. Something's gone wrong when it's 100%. You know, they say if everyone in the Sanhedrin said somebody was guilty of a death penalty, then the person was acquitted because that's the Jewish law. If it's unanimous, they say that the judges weren't critical enough, that nobody was able to think about offer a non-guilty verdict. So they said the person is let off the hook. Isn't that interesting? So in this case, also, I've done something wrong if we all agree. But okay, very interesting. We're all partially tribal. Maybe that actually is makes sense with what we're going to discuss. Okay, friends, tribalism gets a bad rap. Defined as feeling loyalty to those in one's own group as opposed to people outside the group, tribalism is often used as an evolutionary explanation as to why we have such strong negative feelings towards people who are not in our group or tribe. Rather than a modern-day phenomenon, war and intergroup strife are considered by many evolutionary psychologists to be residual of our hunter-gatherer past. In fact, a cross-cultural ethnographic study of 31 hunter-gatherer societies found that 64% engage in warfare once in every 2 years. Ultimately, humans evolved as pack animals. Our lives are carried out through a series of tribes, beginning with our most intimate tribe or our families. We are shaped by our affiliations along lines of race and religion, tribes with which we share genetic traits and cultural histories. Other tribes we choose, political, geographic, perhaps even the schools we attend or the sports teams we cheer for. Maybe you're a part of the New York Knicks tribe. Maybe you're a part of the Boston Celtics tribe. We feel great identity with and loyalty to our tribes. While this is not an inherently bad thing, it often results in an us versus them mentality, which can lead to violent strife. Many thinkers have begun to argue that tribalism is a threat to civil society and all we hold dear. In a much-cited op-ed in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman decried tribalism as a virus, which is infecting some of the most vibrant multi-sectarian democracies in the world. It's not just liberals who feel this way. The dangers of tribalism seem to be a rare point of agreement between opposing political camps. Tucker Carlson, didn't think I was going to quote him today. Tucker Carlson has made the claim that schools are creating tribalism in our kids, albeit as part of an shameful, baseless argument against children wearing masks during the height of COVID. Right? On a less hysterical note, former President Barack Obama noted that we are at the risk of turning away from democratic principles in favor of tribalism. In a commentary for The New Yorker, journalist George Packer summarized the problem in terms of the human desire to belong. American politics, he wrote, today requires a word as primal as tribe to get at the blind allegiances and huge passions of partisan affiliation. Tribes demand loyalty, and in return, they confer the security of belonging. They're badges of identity, not of thought. Right, by the way, as a reminder, about 1/3 of Americans voted for Trump. About 1/3 of Americans voted for Kamala. About 1/3 didn't vote. That's something to remind ourselves of in terms of some of what's happening with tribal. Of course, part of those 2/3 that voted were independents. But part of them were people who would have voted for a political party, no matter who the candidate was. If it was the most horrific candidate, there were people who would always vote Democrat or always vote Republican, no matter what. Then there are people who won't vote no matter who the candidate is. Then there's people who are independent and will vote for who they think is the better candidate. These arguments tend to imply that as humans, we are generally hardwired to hate outsiders. In a view that echoes mainstream consensus about the dangers of the with us or against us mentality of tribal affiliation, Friedman used his column to call for an antidote to tribalism plaguing society before it is too late. Indeed, too many, the solution to today's divided social and political landscape is that we should overcome our tribalism in order to live with more peace and unity. If we could only overthrow tribalism, everything would be good. We'd all be loving, humanitarian universalists. We just sucked out this evolutionary instinct for being tribal. However, it's not so simple. Cultural psychologist Dr. Michael Morris has offered a completely new take on tribalism in his 2024 book, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. Rather than an evolutionary liability to overcome, Dr. Morris argues that tribalism is humankind's best hope for the future. According to Dr. Morris's book, tribalism is part of what gives us the richness of culture. He ultimately argues from the perspective of evolutionary psychology that our tribal instincts evolved not to make us hate each other, but to enable us to be human and to cooperate and collaborate with each other. As well as a professor of psychology at Columbia University, Dr. Morris is a professor at the Columbia Business School with particular expertise in leadership. One of the main arguments of his book is that by harnessing shared cultural identities, leaders can unify disparate groups of people and mobilize them to work together. If we really were genetically predisposed to hate, Morris argues, our species would have died out a long time ago. In an interview with podcaster Russ Roberts, Morris assured listeners that we did not evolve to hate. That's not what our group instincts are, he said, pointing out that historically there was a species that did not evolve, a species that did evolve to hate outsiders. It's called Neanderthals. And they went extinct because of their instinct to hate. Morris went on to explain that because Homo sapiens were not inclined towards broad-scale cooperation, that they were able to survive and thrive, as, quote, turned out to be the winning strategy, right? The opposite to, or the synonym with hate is not tribal, right? The opposite to hate is collaboration. And that is what tribalism gave us, was the ability to cooperate. When we talk about tribalism, we're not starting from instincts of hate, but from something that was fundamental to our survival, cooperation and collaboration. Simply put, we are hardwired to work together with outside groups, not to hate them. One of the common misconceptions, according to Dr. Morris, is that tribalism can be equated with parochialism, a rejection of universalism. But that doesn't always have to be the case. In another interview, Morris pointed out that what we think about a city that's cosmopolitan, such as Paris or New York, it's composed of neighborhoods that are very different from each other, right? If you want, in the olden days, if you wanted a new identity, you couldn't just move to a new town. If you didn't want to be Jew anymore, you had to be Christian. You could be secular. There was no secular space. You're gonna move to Saudi Arabia and become Muslim. You're gonna move to another city or village and become Christian. Today, if you live in New York City and you don't want to be a Satmar Chassid, you take a train, subway one stop away, and now you're in a new. And now you can be a hipster or whatever you want to be, right? You just take the subway one stop, right? So these cities are composed of neighborhoods that are very different from each other. That, he says, is part of the magic. That you can be in Chinatown and then just a few blocks away, you're in the East Village. All of these neighborhoods reflect different tribes, but there's a spirit of curiosity and mutual learning between these groups. Far from homogenizing, this kind of tribalism can be deeply cosmopolitan and culturally rich. Nobody's pretending there's not real dangers associated with tribalism. Of course, there are violent extremes as a result of demonizing everyone outside of the in-group. Of course, this is dysfunctional. Of course, when tribalism is equated with nationalism, things can get problematic. These are all iterations of what psychologists today call bad tribalism. That's not a super smart term, but there's scholars that call it bad tribalism. But when divorced from those negative aspects, tribalism can be, according to many, truly positive. In thinking about how to get our tribalism to work for us, Morris highlights three major categories of instincts, which correspond to those identified by evolutionists. 1, to imitate peers. 2, to emulate heroes. And 3, to perpetuate traditions. This is something tribes do, right? Tribes create networks that want to have rituals and traditions that keep the tribe together. They want to talk about heroes. They want to emulate peers, right? If you look at the Jewish tribe, right, part of what we're doing in number 3 of maintaining the Passover Seder is perpetuating traditions to keep the tribe together, talking about heroes of liberation and justice, and figuring out who are some of our close peers today that we can work with to achieve that, in addition to those ancient models. These categories correlate to those identified by those who study human evolution. So before we go on, it feels important to pause here to acknowledge that evolution and adaptation are not ethical measures, i.e., to be stronger does not mean to be better. I'm someone who does not believe that everything about evolution produces moral progress, right? That falls in line with Nazi thought in some versions, right, of the higher race, the pure race. Traits that we can acknowledge as being evolutionary advantages don't necessarily correlate to a moral good. That said, it is worth learning about what has enabled us to survive and grow as a species. The fundamental categories highlighted by Morris are not so easy to dismiss. With this in mind, let's go through them one at a time. So, when it comes to the instinct to imitate peers, we're all familiar with the ways in which we tend to match the behavior of our classmates, co-workers, and neighbors. In prehistoric times, this meshing, quote, gave us the gift of coordination, Morris says. When we act as a unified force, we are more efficient in our endeavors. In this way, conformity can be seen as adaptive. We often talk about conformity as a bad thing, like, oh, you should be authentic and your own radical self, right? That's an attractive thing to say these days. Conformity is a loser. You're just wearing what everyone else is wearing, doing what everyone else is doing. But actually, conformity can be adaptive. It's true that we often speak negatively about conformity. We extol virtues of being unique, right? We understandably are wary of groupthink. However, the truth remains that it's necessary for our survival that we work together. Imagine how terrifying it would be to drive a car if there was no conformity around driving safety. If people had disagreements that we should stop at red lights and go and follow speed limits, right? Conforming to laws and norms is good for society in certain ways. Because we all conform to these laws about driving safely, a whole system of transportation is possible. Indeed, many psychologists agree that at its best, conformity encourages people to adhere to moral standards, right? Dr. Morris identifies hero worship as another evolutionary mechanism by which innovation can spread, a concept that academic literature refers to as prestige learning. This is another critique I have of contemporary society, that we love egalitarianism. Everyone is equal. Everyone has something to teach. Everyone is, equally valid in their viewpoints. And there's something beautiful about that, from a society that didn't, have that such an egalitarian ethos to it. However, we've also diminished the value of heroes in our society, where we want to break down people and take them off their mantle, right? No, there's no such thing as great people anymore. Everyone is the same, right? In the spirit of equality, right? But it shouldn't be so difficult for us to still hold heroes and also hold that everyone has equal rights and everyone has equal value. So this kind of selective social learning is considered a major factor in human survival, as it allows individuals to acquire useful social information by copying thriving individuals, right? Heroes we want to be like, and emulating their behavior. Morris credits this adaptive trait with the eventual development of a selfless strain in humans because of the tendency we have to emulate those with social capital. By the way, think of like the obsession now with the new pope. I mean, it's like literally every news outlet everywhere, obsession with this person. Now, there's something to critique there of like, gosh, like on the other hand, like if out of I'm also very interested. I respect Catholics. I respect people who have devoted their lives to service, going through a very selective process to someone they think is a noble person that represents their values and virtues and selecting them. And I want to really know who that person is and learn from what they're doing well and what they've committed their life to. I find that very interesting. It's very different than an election and voting in politicians who I might agree with their platform, but they might not be a role model for me. Okay, maybe they're a role model in some speech they gave, but like I never look to politicians as virtue models for me. I look to them as power players that I want to work with. But who are the people that I want to be like in the world? Like, and how do we identify those people? We've always, consciously or unconsciously, as humans, been doing that. So, for example, the woolly mammoth is brought down by a lead spears person who probably paid the ultimate price. But the group was able to get this large game. In this way, selflessness becomes a value to be emulated. This is why Morris asserts we begin to see archaeological evidence of altruism, for example, seeing people with some physical handicap who live into adulthood, right? That's very interesting. It used to be that those who had a disability would die off sooner. They were viewed as weak. But our ability to construct societies that provide safety nets for those who would left to themselves not survive. One especially moving example of this is the skeleton of a paralyzed young man who lived 4,000 years ago, kept alive thanks to the care of his community. This ability to care was also part of evolutionary psychology in society, where it wasn't only the strongest to survive, but societies who were able to figure out how to care for those who couldn't make it on their own. Of course, nobody can make it on their own. The third category of evolutionary instinct, to preserve tradition, is what has allowed us also as a species to grow our knowledge base. It created a tribal memory, and groups didn't have to reinvent the wheel every generation, says Dr. Morris. Instead, they can build on what had been achieved in the previous generation. By the way, I'll name something that's going on here with gender, which is, of course, thankfully changed recently. But historically, men, lots of exceptions to this, men passed on tradition through writing. Men were illiterate and women were not, and men wrote things and they passed on this reading and writing and these books. But women had oral traditions in ways that men didn't, for various reasons, and and this is true Jewishly and globally in terms of how women and men differently pass down traditions, and this has been codified in many ways. Thankfully, the rates of literacy and of girls and women have risen in some societies even to surpass boys and men. And there's still more work to do in terms of global education for girls, of course. But I just want to name that part about tribal memory. In this mode of cultural accumulation, the culture itself becomes wiser than any one individual could be because we can tap into a vast pool of inherited wisdom. Morris reminds us that 99% of what we know is inherited knowledge. We did not figure out anything by ourselves, or very little. To be clear, this doesn't mean that everything in our heritage is positive. But what it does mean is that being part of a tribe and having traditions and a connection to ancestry is vitally important for groups to flourish, right? I, Shmuly Yanklowitz, never figured out any unique math problem in my life. I just inherited whatever mathematicians and teachers of math, thought were worthy. I never wrote a novel. I've just read dozens of novels that were written. And that's true in science. I've never conducted a science experiment. I mean, I guess I did in my doctorate, but relatively small. But generally, everything I know in terms of science and literature and math is just inherited. And I would say 99% of what I know Jewishly is inherited. I mean, I try to do some creative things, but not so much. So what does this all mean for bridge building? So after all, we live in a political moment that feels to many of us unprecedented in its divisiveness. Is it possible to bridge the chasm between American Democrats and Republicans, for example? Morris asserts that a common mistake is to try to bring opposing sides together through dialogue, as if by listening to the other side, we will become less divided. Honestly, I feel more angry when I listen to someone on the polar extreme opposite. The reality is that the divides may be too big to talk about or listen our way out of solving the problem. The key to bridging divides between opposing groups may be to remember that each of us has multiple tribal affiliations. To bridge divides, you must find the affiliations that you share rather than discuss the ones you don't share. For example, bring together a bipartisan group of people who are all into hiking or into Tuscan cuisine or certain technologies or music. Have them talk about what they share rather than the politics that divide them, right? And now to be clear, one of the things the Trump election showed us is that it's not about race, right? More Black people voted for Trump in this election than the first one. More Hispanic people voted for Trump than in the first one, right? It's not just like people of color are liberal and white people. It's much more complicated. And so how can Black people come back together around race, right? And not just this division. How can Hispanic people come back together around that culture? Even Jews, let's say, a conservative number, 70% of Jews are liberal. That still leaves 20 to 30%. How can Jews come back together around Judaism, right? And so, anyways, this body of research says, forget the thing about talking about political differences. You're going to hate the person more after you realize that the stupidity of the things they believe and why they believe them, right? Instead, come together with them in a basketball game, together with them around this activity you love. That will help us to heal divides. This has been found to be, quote, effective at depolarization, at reducing negative attitudes about the other side, and at producing new friendships that actually last beyond the event. When we focus on the tribal affiliations that we share, we are less divided by those we do not. So it's clear that tribalism fulfills a deep human desire for identity and belonging. And while this can lead to strife, it can also be leveraged to lead to deeper connection. Another way to think of tribalism is that it offers thick as opposed to thin identities. The distinction between thick and thin identities has been used since the 1980s among sociologists. As the name suggests, thick identities are more substantial, based on shared cultural and community relations. On the other hand, thin identities tend to be more localized, perhaps related to a specific problem or situation. Thick identities tend to be fixed and rooted. Thin identities tend to be more fluid. The contrast between thick and thin is used all over the social sciences. For example, one study compared thick forms of citizenship, ones that combine birthright, descent, and active contribution to the country, to thin forms of citizenship that are based on business deals. So one of the things that older Jews don't get about younger Jews, now I don't want to make it just about age, but let's say older Jews who have thick Jewish identities and younger Jews who have thin Jewish identities, they can't understand, neither side can understand, why that younger generation has multiple identities. An older Jew of a generation that's more likely to have thick Jewish identities, and I would put myself in that camp myself, says, I am primarily Jewish. And yes, I have some other identities which are secondary and and additional, but I'm so deeply primarily this one identity, right? Whereas someone with a thin identity say, yeah, I'm a Jew, but I'm also like Buddhist, and I'm also like a Democrat, and I'm also a part of this like WhatsApp group that's like really big to my day, and I'm a really big sports fan of these two teams, and none of those outweighs the other. Like a Jewish event or like a Knicks game, like it's not clear what I do, or like so it's one of the generational divides, these thick and thin identities and the multiplicity of identities that emerge in later generations. An ongoing conversation in the Jewish world is the question of how we thicken Jewish identities. That's what Jewish communal professionals and people of other religions are trying to do. See, how do we take people who think about it this way? How do we take people with thin Jewish identities and give them thick Jewish identities? The Jewish writer and speaker, Dr. Erica Brown, pictured here, suggests that a thick Jewish identity is one that covers the categories of the behavioral, like going to a Jewish event, the emotional, being concerned with the survival of the Jewish people, right? That's another case when it comes to Israel, that someone with a thick Jewish identity might feel so deeply connected to the security of Israel, whereas one with a thick Jewish identity might say, okay, like I'm more concerned with my values of democracy and peace, and security is one of the many values, but I don't feel in a deep way like attached to survivalism. And also, in addition to the behavioral and the emotional, the intellectual, continuing to learn more about Jewish culture and practices. In concert, these connections foster a deep, persistent Jewish identity, i.e., a thick Jewish identity, as opposed to one that is inconsistent or situational, i.e., thin. She gave a funny example of this when she visited VBM a few years ago. She said, in the camping world, Jews who went to camp for like a decade have a very, very thick identity in relationship to that camp. Maybe you went, especially at Camp Ramah. People went to Camp Ramah for a decade, or like that's their life. Those are their people, Camp Ramah, right? I'm not critiquing, I'm just naming, right? And she gave an example. She was at this like alumni event, and this guy who was like 70 at this like Ramah alumni event said to his wife, can I not sit at our family table? I want to go sit with my bunk. And when he got with his bunk, they like had these behaviors they did together, that lasted for like many decades. Right? He said, this is a thick camp identity of being an alum of this camp, right? In a way that as a 70-year-old, these experiences from over 50 years ago are so deep into a person's cells. I think people have this relationship with their fraternity and sorority as well. They get together every year with their frat brothers or their sorority sisters, and like these are their people. And like the jokes they tell are the ones they told from when they were 19 years old. Like these are very thick identities. Or people who are diehard sports fans. Literally, they have a bad day if their team lost the playoff game the night before. Like they are sad the next day. It's such a thick identity. Or again, those who, when their political party loses, they might be sad about the damage that's going to be caused. Right? That's one way to do it. But they might be sad because their identity group is a loser, right, in this moment. And that also has to do with a thick identity. As Jews, there can no doubt be that our identity is tribal, literally springing from the 12 tribes of Jacob, Yaakov Avinu. Like we talk about the birth of Judaism as literally being tribal. Even today, a tongue-in-cheek way to ask if someone is Jewish is to inquire if they're part of the tribe. What would it mean to divest from our tribalism as Jews? Surely it would mean to assimilate, to forgo our particular identity for a universal one, to say, I'm no longer a part of this tribe, I'm just a part of humanity. Some modern Jewish thinkers do indeed encourage Jews to forgo tribalism, opening Judaism to anyone, quote, who claims to be a Jew, encouraging everyone, quote, stop praying like it's 12:55, right? There are those who suggest Judaism is just a choice. Actually, there's a funny case. No, it's not funny. It is interesting. Someone has been emailing me over the last week who is a sailor, and he feels alienated on his ship because he's a vegan. And he asked if I would write a letter for him saying that he should have the right to vegan food as a sailor because of Jewish values that lean towards veganism. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. So tell me about your Jewish identity to veganism. He said, oh, I'm not a Jew. I said, you're not a Jew. So like, why do you want a rabbi to write a letter and support? He said, because I think Judaism is the religion that's probably most aligned with my values. So that's an interesting thing where he's like, I identify as a Jew, not because I was born a Jew, not because I converted to be a Jew, because I identify with Judaism. So I'm kind of a Jew. So will you write a letter that for me as a Jew, right? And in postmodernity, where identity is much more fluid and porous, there is this growing sense. They did a Pew study of students on campus. The number one group that said they were Jews were people with a Jewish father and mother. The number two group that said they were Jews were people with either a Jewish father or a Jewish mother or who had converted. The number three group on campus that said they identified as Jews were people who did not have a Jewish father, did not have a Jewish mother, and not converted. They simply identified as Jews, right? And I find that very interesting about our time period, about identity. Like, if I want to identify as a Buddhist today, I'm in. Right? You don't have to go to convert to Buddhism. I'm, some sects of Christianity as well. I can become Christian now, right? I don't, right? Some you have to convert, but in other sects of denomination of Christianity, I just have to say I'm Christian. I'm in, right? But for Judaism, it's never been like that, right? It's not just a self-affirmation. It's not existential. It's communal. It's tribal. You have to join the tribe. It's like identity in America. You can't just cross a border and be American. You have to become an American citizen to be a part of it, to be American. So anyways, but today we might say, like, is an undocumented person who's lived here 20 years, are they in some sense American? Do they need the paperwork to be American? Or does living here for a certain amount of time, does speaking English, does being a part of the society make you in some way partially American? These are interesting questions about identity. So such arguments definitely have an audience. In today's day and age, there's many liberal Jews who are embarrassed at the thought of Jewish peoplehood or Jewish tribalism, thinking of it as backwards or toxic. I don't wish to completely dismiss the discomfort around tribalism. There is, again, bad tribalism. The dangers of an us versus them mentality are very real. Let's think of David Friedman comparing liberal Jews to capos. The term capo, for anyone who doesn't know it, is perhaps the worst insult a Jew can levy at another Jew, as it is the word for Jewish inmates who worked for Nazi authorities in the camps. But while there are some truly horrible manifestations of that parochialism, we shouldn't perhaps be so quick to discard of our Jewish tribal identity. The Jewish studies scholar Noam Pianko made a stir in 2015 when he published Jewish Peoplehood in American Innovation. In his book, Pianko argues that the rhetoric of Jewish peoplehood is a 20th century post-Holocaust invention by American Jews, reflecting an ideology that responded to the needs of the moment. For example, while many people assume that the rousing song, Am Yisrael Chai, is hundreds of years old, it was in fact composed in the 20th century by Shlomo Carlebach, the so-called singing rabbi, as an anthem for the Soviet Jewry movement. While some people found merit in Pianko's historical arguments, others slammed the book for denying how very ancient the concept of Jewish peoplehood actually is. We're told quite clearly in Torah, for you are a people consecrated to Hashem. Clearly, Am Yisrael is an ancient idea, evidenced in our sacred texts. However, it's also true that the concept of Jewish peoplehood has continued to be redefined as society's understanding of identity has changed. After all, up until the 20th century, there really was no concept of ethnicity, with the first usage of the term ethnic group recorded by the Oxford English Dictionary no earlier than 1935. But despite all of this, there's great arguments for preserving Jewish tribalism. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory gave much thought to the nature of Jewish tribalism and its relationship to universality. In his brilliant work, The Dignity of Difference, Sacks argues that the path towards peace is not made by dismissing our religious differences, but by honoring them. Published a year after 9/11, book emerged in a world where the dangers of religious difference were all too present, as the politics of identity began to overtake the politics of ideology. He was partially responding to Islamophobia. Sacks argues that we are not going to heal society by uniting in a way that dismisses our unique differences. Rather, by honoring the dignity of difference, as the title says, religion can become a force for peace. Right? I want to share a story I've shared before, but when I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum in this religious leaders conversation, someone of a prominent leader of a certain religious group, I won't name which group because it's not about that, stood up and said, "We are all the same. Let's stop talking about our differences and realize that our religions are the same, here for the same things." I stood up and I said, "I disagree with you. I think that is a harmful ideology. If you want to pretend our religions are the same, you are dismissing differences that matter to people, right? Yes, human beings have a lot in common that we should build off the commonality. But our differences matter. Race matters. Gender matters. Religions matter. Different values matter. And we should have a dignity of difference rather than dismissing difference." There's an element of paradox at play here, that a big part of how Jews can bring healing to the world in a universal way rests on our tribalism, or one might say, particularism. Particularism is defined as an attachment to one's own group, whereas universalism refers to unbiased concern for all humanity. One who says, "Oh, I don't care who someone is, I'll support everyone equally," right, is very different than an ideology of partiality. To some extent, Judaism has always embraced ethical particularism, which rejects the idea that all people are equal in my moral treatment. Ethical particularism, or partiality, insists that we have different obligations to different people. For example, I'm obligated to my mother differently than to a stranger. I'm obligated to someone local differently than someone at a distance. I'm obligated to a Jew differently than a Gentile. This is not an argument that we have moral obligations only to Jews or to family or to local people. We have a moral obligations to all people and even beyond people. It's just that the obligations themselves differ based on relationship. The author Yossi Klein Halevi, who was just here last month, wrote that Jewish history speaks to us through contrasting commands to remember. The first voice commands us to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and the message of that command is, don't be brutal. The second voice commands us to remember how the tribe of Amalek attacked us without provocation while we were wandering in the desert, and the message of that command is, don't be naive. These two voices can also be understood as of universalism and particularism. We need both. We must heed both. Friends, to conclude, while we want to stay mindful of the universal obligations that bind us to the whole world, we don't want to erase communities of uniqueness. Healthy tribalism means deep concern for the affiliations we build out of love and connection, not those born from hate and exclusion. By cultivating good tribalism, we have an opportunity, as Dr. Morris says, to come together across tribes. Okay, dear friends, I would love to hear from you. Yes, Lauren, and then Janie.
I find a lot of comfort being part of the Jewish tribe. You know, I go to shul and it's like, wow, mishpacha. And, you know, sometimes, like I remember a few times I've been in New York and I go to a Broadway show and I'm sitting next to another person. We get to talking. She's Jewish too. And there's just something warm and fuzzy about that. I feel secure. And yet my other tribal identity, well, other than Toronto Maple Leaf fan, is Torontonian, Canadian. And I can't tell you how deeply, deeply wounded I've been since this anti-Semitism that's just so rampant in Canada, but in Toronto, I mean, they just released the hate crime. The police released hate crime stats for 2024, and 45% of hate crimes in Toronto were directed against Jews, and we're a very tiny minority. So, I guess I go to my Jewish tribe to console me, but at times then it becomes frightening to go out of that tribe. Um, Anyways, I just wanted to put it out there and see how other people are feeling.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that that very much resonates with the studies. The studies are showing a surging of thicker Jewish identities post October 7th. And a new study that came out last month showed all the more so. Of course, there are those who don't fall into that camp, but huge numbers of surging thick identities post October 7th. And people thought it would last 6 months. 18 months later, it's still surging. So that's to say that one form of tribal thick identity emerges from threat from the outside. That's only one form. Another form emerges from commonality and affinities and this and that. Um, but certainly threat from the outside is one of the significant ones. I would say that would also have to do if we could call women a tribe. I don't know if you can call women a tribe. But I think one of the things that might bind women together, among other things, might be the threat of men. The sense that society at large is hostile towards women, and we women stick together because of this threat. And some women feel safer among women, understandably, right? Because of that. It's the same with men. Some men actually feel safer among men. And but that's for different reasons. I mean, it's so in any case, yeah, so thank you for sharing that. The other thing it reminds me of, Lauren, is the old joke of how Moshe and Yossi go to shul. Everyone knows why Moshe goes to shul because he's a big believer in God. But why does Yossi go to shul? He's an atheist. So I say, Moshe, Yossi, why do you go to shul? Moshe says, I go to shul to pray to God. I say, Yossi, why do you go to shul? He goes, I go to shul to talk to Moshe. Right? So one person goes to talk to God, one person talks to another person. So many people want Jewish community, not for religion, but for tribalism, right? For tribalism. So that's another factor. But yes, Lauren, thank you for sharing that. Yes, Janie, then Ken, and then Matt.
I was just going to say, some of
Yeah.
us go for the scotch and the kugel.
Yes, yes, that is absolutely true. And actually, I had a big disagreement with one of my teachers 20 years ago. He said Chabad is going to win, and he's right. Chabad has won. Chabad is by far the fastest growing denomination in American society. Reform, conservative, tanking, right? Aspects of modern Orthodoxy, okay, ups and downs based on the city. Chabad, booming. Why why was his prediction for Chabad booming? He says all those other denominations, they want to talk about ideas and values, but that's not what the American Jew wants. An American Jew wants Solent and Scott, right? And he said, if you don't figure out how to give the people what they want, if you think they want a beautiful melody and they want a great sermon and a great stimulating class, you're wrong. They want scotch and good food. And I thought he was wrong, but he might have been right. He might have been right. That a lot of people want to get, they want community, they want food, they want some booze, and that might be okay. I mean, that's not what we're here to do at VBM, and we do feed people, but we do feed people sometimes. But you all show up each week, and you give me faith that I've never given you a food or drink, at least not on Zoom. But anyways, yeah, thanks, Lauren. Yes, Janie.
I'm I'm really confused now this morning because you're talking about tribalism, and in an extreme, it would be Neanderthal, correct? And yet later you say you have to be Jewish to claim Jewish. I've always thought that we strive to have multiple identities, that we have connections with as many tribes as possible to become a universal person, to have shared values, shared interests with whatever, with as many people as possible, and yet not have one so dominant that it would, in a sense, negate all of the other identities that you have. So talk to me about particularism. I'm really confused.
Yes. Danny, you are one of those rare broad people who is so eclectic and connected to so many different ways of being in the world. And that serves you and everyone around you so well because of how many types of communities you're a part of and are affiliated with. And you're, I think, hardwired different than most people who want to remain in, in one space with one type of person. And I think rather than promote one type, I'm interested in honoring different types of ways of being in the world. And I think that you very much fall into that camp, which I previously labeled generational, but you're certainly an exception to that. Of these multiple identities, which are very strong. And so I think that there's a place in the world for people who are deeply Catholic, and their people are Catholic. People who are so proud to be a black lesbian, and their people are black lesbians, and people are so happy to be, in the Muslim Republican Club, and those are their people, Muslim Republican. And there's a place in the world for people who are holding so many different identities, are floating between different groups, and even though Janie, you don't identify as a Jew, I consider you as a part of the Jewish community. You know what I mean? There are people who are part of communities. And I would say, my belief, that people who are intermarried, the non-Jewish spouse should be viewed as part of the Jewish community, right? Even though they're not a Jew, they're part of the community, and so I appreciate what you're saying, and I think one of the things we want to avoid is cultural appropriation, right? I think the evangelical move to wear kippahs and lead a seder, I think most Jews find kind of distasteful. Hold on, this is Jewish stuff, and that applies to lots of different, cultural groups as well. So, how do we, understand that I'm I am partially an identity, but I'm not really an insider in the way that I should be leading. Some evangelicals might think, oh, I'm an evangelical Zionist, so I have the right to wear kippah and lead a seder and kind of identify as Jews. And I think that part of Christian nationalism is kind of headed to some dangerous places, in my view. So, anyways, that's a whole other conversation. Thank you, Janie, for sharing that. There's more to say there, but Ken, let's go to you.
The thing I had the most trouble with in this session was the idea of the possibility that thick identity was better than thin. Okay, because to me, having a thick identity of one kind makes it more difficult to interact with people who are outside. When you were talking earlier, you were talking about how you can't talk to a Republican about politics, but you can talk to them about hiking. So unless you have a somewhat thin identity, and so you have other identities in other groups, it's almost impossible to have a conversation with people outside your group. You can only talk to thick people. And that makes it, I think, much more difficult and makes most of tribalism then negative rather than, or bad, as the technical term is now. So I think in order to have tribalism be a good force, you have to take the good parts of being in your group, but not be exclusive, not assume that people outside your group are missing something, are not doing it, don't matter. I mean, I think of my son-in-law who's not Jewish, who's the president of his brotherhood in their shul. So you can join the group, at least peripherally. He goes to services as often as my daughter does, and so she's the head of the youth group at the temple. They both participate heavily in that, but neither one of them is what I would call a thick Jew. They're It's one of their things that make them up, but there are lots of other things. I mean, I think that's true of most of us, and I think that's why all of us answered we're all partially tribal.
Okay, good. So good. So much to say there. I'm so glad you flagged this. So let me give the second reason why. And now I'm not praising Chabad. I'm only observing Chabad. So I have many critiques of Chabad. Let me give the number one reason why Chabad is thriving, I think, secondarily to the food and scotch thing. I think it's because they get this thick, thin identity. Chabad is not about identity. They're about mitzvah. They want a Jew to do a mitzvah. They say, oh, on campus, put on tefillin, or here, light Shabbat candles, or here, do this meal. They think, I'm not here to change you and your identity. I just want you to do one mitzvah. And I think a lot of Jewish communal life is trying to move people with thin Jewish identities into thick Jewish identities, not getting that those people don't want thick Jewish identities. They want thin Jewish identities and they want multiple identities. And so I think Chabad gets that sense that when they're meeting someone, they don't want to be that they don't want that change. And so I think this is a crucial thing that is happening, phenomenon that's happening now in the Jewish world around engagement and around these assumptions of how Jewy do people really want to be. And so, yes, let me say that. Now, on that political point, I think it's a really interesting thing around how the people we connect with tend to be around those thick and thin identities. For someone, they might say, as a liberal, that's a thin part of my identity. Like I happen to be liberal, but like I don't really care. Like if my friends are, Trump supporters or Kamala supporters or Bernie supporters or centrists. Like, someone else might say, oh my gosh, my commitment to free speech and women's rights or supporting disenfranchised minorities or the dignity of gay people is so fundamental to who I am. Like my identity of committing to these liberal causes, it's so fundamental to me. It's a thick political identity around these values that I really can't be in relationship with people who don't hold these core assumptions, right? And I just remind us that that's also a thick identity, just like there can be a thick religious identity. And I think for most of us that in some aspects of our lives we have thick identities, and some aspects of our life we have thin. And it's a good task to do after this session. Where would you identify your thickest ones? Maybe it's your family unit. Maybe it's your political camp. Maybe it's your religious group. Maybe it's this card group you've been playing cards with for 40 years. There's all these different groups and affiliations that we might have thick identities with and other ones thin. Few people are just thin everywhere or thick everywhere. Right? We kind of float in and out of different spaces. Okay, Matthew, to you and then Sarah.
Okay, so a couple of things. I prefer to use the word core identity rather than thick identity. And two things. When your group becomes threatened, October 7th, that core identity, which may not have been on the surface, comes up, and you're now becoming more tribal. And Lauren, I'm probably wrong about Canadian politics, but with Trump's comments, Canada should be a state, Canada's horrible, the Canadian nationalism, I believe is in one other country also, came out that how dare you as an outsider tell me what is a latent core value. When you're attacked, everyone comes together. And Trump was perceived by many friends here are Canadians who have been, one of them just came back from Europe and was scared to come back because she didn't know if her green card would work. But she said, I am a Canadian. My kids are Americans, but I've been here 25 years. But I was attacked. And so I think we have certain core values. You may not go to shul, you may not be a practicing Jew, but you know you are a Jew. And when Jews get attacked, you know it could happen to you. You don't want to repeat the Shoah that, why did they say that? Why didn't they know? So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think everyone has many identities, but you have to find the line you can't cross without triggering another action. Does that make sense? And Lauren, did I
Yeah, that makes
mistake
sense.
Canadian?
Right on.
Yeah,
And we're
because
not
Yeah.
buying American and we're not visiting the US. So there.
and the number of Canadians selling homes in Arizona this spring season is 5 times the normal amount.
I'm
And
not
no one's buying.
surprised. I'm not
And it's
surprised.
affecting prices here because people don't want to feel unwelcome.
That's right. But I love you guys. Just so you know, I love you all. Even though you're
come visit.
Americans.
So okay, so good. Just before we go to Sarah, so one other kind of litmus test of whatever we want to call thick identities or core commitments is around if we feel more proud or more embarrassed when someone of that population is on the cover of the New York Times for something, right? If a Jew is in a scandal, are you more embarrassed than if it's someone else? If a Jew wins a Nobel Prize or does this amazing heroic thing, are you more proud than if it's someone else? And for some they would say, no, it's just another story. Some of us we really feel connected. And I think yeah, that's another possibility. So anyway, Sarah, yeah, over to you. Thank you, Matthew.
I like that question, Shmuly, because that more than anything else kind of helps me focus in on perhaps this piece of tribalism for me. I struggle. Okay, so I appreciated what Janie had to say because I've always identified in so many, I guess, tribes. I'm not sure if tribe's the right answer, but yeah. And yet, I was raised by a mother who constantly reminded me that didn't have to do what other people did. And I didn't have to believe what they believed. That kind of belonging wasn't necessarily part of who I am, and that I needed to be, I guess, more in integrity and authenticity with what Matthew was just talking about in terms of my core values. And yet, I don't know that people who identify with a tribe necessarily share their core values. I'm not convinced of that. I think that it's much more superficial for most folks in terms of their tribal identity. And like Ken, I think that our thinness is very malleable, that the wind may blow and I may become a bit thinner or thicker because of how the wind is blowing. So I find this whole thing really interesting and curious. And I think there is an inner part of me that has always, I've always identified as Jewish, no matter how far I got away from the tribe, and had what you describe of that sense of either shame or delight when something appears about another Jewish person. On the other hand, I always also struggled to be identified as a tribal member because I don't want people defining me. I want to be able to define myself and be authentic from my essence rather than from an idea of who that tribal member is.
Okay, so interesting. Thank you. There's so much more to say, but we have to pause here. But thank you all so much. And this is so interesting. And as we continue to think about how humans have evolved in our group identities, in our group affiliations, what parts of that is still serving us in society? What parts of those do we really have to evolve beyond that are really getting in the way of humanity coming together to solve problems and see our core humanity and dignity and move away from war and conflict and these terrible parts of tribalism that are just tearing us apart? And what parts of us give us meaning and give us connection and give us belonging? And this is We see a lot of extremes of this today, those who are dismissing all aspects of these identities and those who are doubling down in ways that are tearing us apart. So I think this is at the core of what it means to solve some of these societal problems now. Look forward to seeing you next week and hopefully sooner. Have a beautiful day.
Goodbye.